Midnight, he fathered children with his own daughter twice before she turned 15. This is the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, a case that shocked the small Rabun Gap community in the 1970s. Isolated in the Appalachian Mountains, a family buried dark secrets for generations, until the inevitable collapse revealed a reality many would rather have never known. 026, Rabun Gap, Georgia, 1978, a mountainous region where time seemed to run more slowly than in the rest of the country. Isolated communities maintained their own traditions, protected by deep valleys and precarious roads that made access difficult for outsiders. In this scenario, the Dawson family built their own reality, away from external eyes and the laws governing conventional society. 054, Willard Dawson, 42 years old in 1978, was a descendant of one of the first families to settle in that region in the early 19th century. His ancestors had arrived as pioneers, homesteading the tall lands where they built a small rural property. Over generations, the Dawsons became known for their isolation and distrust of strangers, rarely coming down to the city except to buy essential supplies. 118, the Dawson property was approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest town, at the end of a dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains. The main house, a two-story wooden structure built by Willard's grandfather, was visibly deteriorated. A partially collapsed barn, a water well, and some cultivated areas completed the property where Willard, his wife Martha, and their 5 children lived. 145, Martha Dawson, born Martha Collins, was Willard's second-degree cousin. The two had married when she was only 16, following a family tradition of unions between relatives dating back generations. Martha had an erased countenance, eyes always downcast, and she rarely spoke in the presence of strangers. At 38, she appeared much older, the result of a life of deprivation and the physical and emotional wear of multiple pregnancies in precarious conditions. 212, the couple had 5 children, 3 boys, Jacob, 19, Thomas, 17, and Samuel, 10, and 2 girls, Sarah, 15, and Rebecca, 8, all shared similar physical characteristics: below-average stature, asymmetrical features, and obvious dental problems. Jacob and Thomas already showed signs of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of apathy and explosions of unexplained aggression. 238, the story began to surface when Sarah Dawson, then 15, was taken to the regional hospital after passing out during a rare visit to town with her father. What doctors discovered that day would open the door to an investigation revealing decades of a practice modern society considers one of the greatest taboos: improper relationships between family members, resulting in children with serious developmental problems. 306, check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now so you don't miss impactful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of American families. These are truths few have the courage to tell, but they need to be known so they are never repeated. Dr. Richard Thornton still clearly remembers the day Sarah Dawson arrived at Clayton Community Hospital. 327, it was a cold October morning in 1978, and the 15-year-old was unconscious when her father carried her into the emergency room. Willard Dawson explained that his daughter had passed out while carrying shopping bags and that it wasn't the first time it had happened in recent weeks. There was something about his behavior that bothered me from the first moment, Dr. Thornton said years later. The way he avoided eye contact, how he insisted on staying by her side, how he seemed nervous when we suggested more detailed tests. 347, the initial exam revealed Sarah was extremely anemic and dehydrated, but during a more complete assessment, the truth began to emerge. The teenager was pregnant, approximately in her 5th month. Confronted with this information, Willard grew visibly agitated, insisting he should take his daughter home immediately. At this critical moment, nurse Elaine Parker, with over 20 years of experience in delicate cases, intervened. Sensing signs of possible vulnerability, she created a private moment with Sarah while her father was sent to fill out administrative forms. 438, when we were finally alone, I asked her about the pregnancy, Elaine reported later. She looked at me with the emptiest eyes I've ever seen and said simply, "Dad said it's like that with all the girls in our family." This dialogue, spoken almost in a whisper, was the first indication of the horror happening on the Dawson property. 457, recognizing the severity of the situation, The medical team immediately called local authorities. Sheriff David Miller, who commanded the Rabun County Police Department at the time, arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. Willard was detained for questioning while Sarah was kept under medical observation. 5:17, authorities obtained a search warrant for the Dawson property, where they found Martha and the other 4 children. The house revealed alarming living conditions. Though there was electricity from a diesel generator, there was no running water or proper sewage system. Rooms were scarcely furnished, with mattresses scattered on the floor. There was little food in the pantry, mostly canned goods and some vegetables from the family garden. Most disturbing, however, was the discovery of a girl about 2 years old hidden in a back room. The child, who appeared on no official record, had several worrying physical characteristics: a head disproportionate to her body, widely spaced eyes, and difficulties moving and communicating. 6:03, Martha Dawson, when asked about the child, revealed through tears that this was Emma, Sarah's daughter, and that Emma's father, according to Martha, was Willard himself. Preliminary investigation revealed Sarah had given birth to Emma when she was only 13. The girl had never been registered, had never received medical attention, and her existence was unknown to any authority. Sarah was now pregnant again, also by her father. 6:27, as the investigation advanced, an even more disturbing picture emerged. School records showed Sarah had attended local school only until age 10, when Willard stated he would educate her at home, something that never happened. The 3 boys had also left school early, while Rebecca, the youngest, had never been enrolled. Neighbors from the nearest properties, though several kilometers away, reported rarely seeing the Dawson family. They appeared in town maybe 3 or 4 times a year, always with just 1 or 2 of the children, never the whole family, a local merchant reported. They bought large amounts of supplies and returned to the mountains. If you tried to make conversation, Willard cut it short and left. 7:07, the investigation also revealed the family survived mainly from the occasional sale of animal skins Willard and the older boys hunted, plus small-scale subsistence farming. Old documents showed the Dawsons had received a significant inheritance from a distant relative in the early 1960s, explaining how they maintained the property despite limited income. But the darker aspect was just beginning to be revealed. The family pattern of consanguinity dated back at least 3 generations. Old county records indicated Willard's grandparents were first-degree cousins, as were his parents. This pattern of close relative unions had created an extremely closed genetic lineage, resulting in a host of physical and cognitive problems that grew more evident with each new generation. 7:47, as Sarah Dawson regained strength in the hospital, her story took shape through fragments shared with the social worker assigned to her case, Eleanor Winters. With patience and sensitivity, Eleanor gradually gained the teenager's trust, a teenager raised to distrust anyone outside the family. "The world outside is dangerous and full of people who want to separate us," Sarah repeated, clearly echoing what she'd been taught. "Dad always said only within our family could we be truly safe." 8:27, the reality emerging from these conversations was deeply disturbing. According to Sarah, when she turned 12, her father began treating her differently. He explained that in their family, it was tradition for fathers to teach their daughters about adult life. Martha, her mother, had been quietly complicit, having herself undergone a similar experience with her own father decades earlier. When Sarah became pregnant the first time at 13, there was no medical attention sought. Martha, using knowledge passed down through generations, acted as midwife during Emma's birth. 9:17, when asked how she felt giving birth, Sarah showed a disturbing lack of understanding. "Dad said I was special because I gave the family a new perfect member," she explained with devastating simplicity. "He said Emma was more perfect than the others because she came straight from him to me." Sarah's medical and psychological evaluations revealed the devastating impact of isolation and horror. Though chronologically 15, her cognitive and emotional development was significantly delayed. She had difficulty with abstract concepts, a limited vocabulary, and, most worryingly, showed no awareness that what had happened to her was wrong. 10:01, if you are deeply impacted by this story, you are not alone. Leave justice for Sarah in the comments to show we cannot tolerate children growing up in environments of exploitation and neglect. Your voice is important, so these stories are never forgotten. Meanwhile, the investigation into other family members revealed more layers of this disturbing case. 1023, Jacob and Thomas, the older boys, showed clear signs of cognitive deficit. Psychological evaluations indicated both had intellectual development equivalent to children aged 9 or 10, despite being 19 and 17. Samuel, 10, and Rebecca, 8, also showed significant developmental delays, along with health problems like hearing difficulties, congenital heart issues, and dental malformations. 1051, Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, underwent medical evaluations confirming initial suspicions. The 2-year-old had multiple conditions resulting from consanguinity. Beyond the observed physical traits, she had heart problems, low immunity, and significant neuromotor delay. Doctors estimated she would likely never develop cognitive abilities beyond those of a 4 or 5-year-old, even in adulthood. 1114, Martha Dawson, when she finally began speaking to authorities, revealed her own story mirrored Sarah's. Born Martha Collins, she was the daughter of a first-degree cousin of Willard's father. At 15, she was given to Willard as his wife, continuing a cycle she believed was normal within that family branch. "My mother told me this was how things were always done," Martha explained in a recorded statement. She said keeping the family blood pure was important, that mixing with strangers brought weakness. 1156, the investigation revealed this thinking had deep historical roots. The Dawsons' ancestors came from the Scottish Appalachians in the early 19th century, bringing beliefs about maintaining pure family lines. Isolated in the Georgia mountains, far from the social evolution of the rest of the country, these distorted beliefs not only survived but intensified over generations. 1223, the most alarming discovery came when investigators found diaries belonging to Willard's grandfather, written between 1910 and 1935. In them, Edwin Dawson described in disturbing detail his vision of preserving family purity and how he instructed his son, Willard's father, to continue the practice. The diaries also contained almost clinical observations on the results of these unions, noting physical characteristics of children born and which were considered successes or flaws. These documents provided crucial evidence that consanguinity in the Dawson family was not an isolated case but a deliberate system maintained for generations, resulting in an increasingly compromised genetic line. 1312, Willard Dawson's trial began in March 1979 and quickly became one of the most notorious cases in Georgia legal history. The prosecution, led by Howard Reeves, presented a meticulous case supported by physical evidence, medical records, and the devastating testimonies of Dawson family members. The Rabun County Courthouse, a red brick building from the early century, could barely contain public interest. Journalists from Atlanta and national outlets followed every development, while Clayton's small community tried to process that such horror had existed so close for so long. 1341, Willard remained impassive throughout, rarely showing emotion. His defense lawyer, a state-appointed attorney struggling with the case's nature, argued based on cultural isolation and ignorance of modern social laws. "My client is the product of generations of mountain isolation," the lawyer argued. He was raised believing these practices were normal within his family, without access to education that could have corrected this distorted view. This argument was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, which presented evidence that Willard frequently visited town, had a functional radio, and had even worked briefly at a local sawmill in the early 1960s before inheriting the family property. He had sufficient knowledge of the outside world to understand his actions were condemned by society, argued prosecutor Reeves. 1444, the most impactful testimony came from Martha Dawson. After months of psychological counseling, she broke decades of conditioning. In a trembling voice, she described being handed to Willard as a teenager, being kept isolated, and becoming a silent accomplice to the horrors against her own daughter. "I knew it was wrong," she admitted, tears streaming. "But when you spend a lifetime being taught that questioning means betraying the family, you lose the ability to oppose. I failed my daughter, and I will never forgive myself." 1519, medical and psychological experts explained the devastating effects of multigenerational consanguinity. Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist from Emory University, presented a detailed Dawson family tree study, showing how the increasingly restricted genetic pool concentrated harmful recessive genes. What we see in the Dawson family is a textbook example of endogamy's dangers, Dr. Freeman explained. When close relatives have children, the likelihood harmful recessive genes manifest increases dramatically. In this family, where this practice occurred for at least 4 consecutive generations, we see a cascade of genetic problems growing progressively more severe. He described how cognitive deficits, heart problems, and physical malformations in the older children were direct consequences. But it was his discussion of Emma, Sarah, and Willard's daughter that proved most impactful. This child represents extreme inbreeding depression, he explained. When a father has improper relationships with his own daughter who is already the product of a consanguineous lineage, the result is an even greater concentration of problematic recessive genes. The chances of serious developmental and health problems exceed 70%. Medical reports on Sarah's second pregnancy, ongoing during the trial, indicated the fetus already showed multiple developmental complications. Doctors predicted if the pregnancy reached term, the child would likely have even more severe conditions than Emma. 1709, as the trial advanced, the community questioned how this could have gone unnoticed. Local school officials were criticized for not investigating when Dawson children stopped attending. Social services faced questions over the lack of visits to this isolated, large family. Prosecutor Reeves directed part of his closing argument to the systemic failure. "This is not just the judgment of one man," he declared. "It is the judgment of a gaze that looked away, a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable, and a culture of silence that allowed the unthinkable to happen just kilometers from where we sit today." 1815, after 7 days of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Willard Dawson was found guilty on all counts. Judge William Hartford, visibly shaken, imposed the maximum sentence under Georgia law at the time, 3 consecutive 25-year prison terms, ensuring Willard would never leave prison. 1840, 45 years have passed since the Dawson case shocked Georgia and the nation. The consequences of that terrible history continue to reverberate, not only for survivors but as a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and community neglect. Willard Dawson died in Georgia State Penitentiary in 1997 at age 61, never expressing remorse. Martha, after serving 5 years for complicity, spent her remaining life in an assisted community for people with mental disorders. She died in 2012 from heart complications, another common result of generational consanguinity. 1906, the Dawson children's fates followed different paths, all marked by trauma and genetic consequences. Jacob and Thomas, the older boys, never lived independently due to cognitive limitations. Both spent decades in institutions for adults with disabilities. Thomas died in 2010 from kidney failure, and Jacob remains under supervised care. Samuel, only 10 when discovered, received specialized education and intensive care. Though he never fully overcame cognitive deficits, he learned a trade and now lives in an assisted community, working in an adapted carpentry workshop. 1951, Rebecca, the youngest daughter, responded best to intervention. Adopted by a family of university professors, she received special education and extensive therapy. Despite learning difficulties, she completed the equivalent of high school and now works as a library assistant, achieving stability and a significant degree of independence. Sarah Dawson, whose involuntary courage exposed the case, faced a long, difficult recovery. The second pregnancy resulted in a boy with multiple severe conditions who died before his first birthday. Sarah spent years in intensive psychological treatment, gradually understanding the magnitude of her suffering. 2042, at 19, she took an extraordinary step, speaking publicly about her experience. In a 1982 interview for an educational documentary, Sarah, with clearer understanding, expressed her desire that her story serve as a warning. "I don't want anyone else growing up thinking this was normal or acceptable," she said. "I want people to understand isolation isn't protection. It's a prison." Emma, Sarah, and Willard's daughter, grew up under specialized care, facing multiple medical and developmental challenges. Despite pessimistic predictions, she surpassed some expectations, developing basic communication skills and some everyday independence. However, Her cognitive development never exceeded that of a 6-year-old. Emma died in 2001 at age 25 due to congenital heart complications. 2148, Sarah eventually built a life. After years of therapy and remedial education, she married an assistant teacher from a rehabilitation program. They had no children, a conscious decision based on both her trauma and genetic risks. She dedicated her adult life to volunteering for programs preventing family isolation and detecting warning signs. The Dawson property was demolished by county order, considered a monument to human tragedy. The area was reforested and is now part of a nature reserve, with no marker of the decades of horror. 2237, the most important legacy was the impact on public policy and social awareness. After the trial, Georgia completely revised child protection protocols and monitoring for remote families. New laws required regular checks for homeschooled children and created a more robust system for detecting school abandonment. The medical community also learned valuable lessons. Clayton Community Hospital developed specific protocols to identify signs of improper relationships, and regional health training began including modules on detecting genetic problems indicating consanguinity. Genetic experts extensively studied Dawson medical records, scientifically documenting the devastating effects of multigenerational inbreeding. These studies are now used in educational programs worldwide, illustrating why taboos against close relative relationships exist in virtually all cultures. 2328, in 2008, a prevention and education center was named Project Sarah in honor of Sarah Dawson's survival journey. The Atlanta-based center offers resources and support for survivors of improper relationships and trains professionals to identify at-risk families. Sarah passed away in 2019 at 56, leaving a legacy of courage and transformation. Her funeral was attended by dozens of professionals inspired by her story to work in child protection. One of her last wishes was that her story be told not as sensationalism, but as a painful, necessary reminder that extreme isolation can create spaces where the unthinkable becomes reality. 2400 Hours 14, the Dawson history reminds us that even in society's deepest shadows, intervention, healing, and change are possible. It also reminds us of our collective responsibility to recognize warning signs, not to look away from discomfort, and to ensure no child grows up believing suffering is normal or acceptable. 2400 Hours 38, check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now to access deep investigations into cases society prefers to forget, but we must remember to prevent repetition. If you've watched this far, you appreciate this story. Leave a comment saying I watched here so I can meet you and know who truly values the stories on this channel. Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who value truth, however difficult. 25 to 19, this was the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, and the lives forever altered by generations of isolation and consanguinity. A story reminding us that even in the most remote communities, no one should be beyond the reach of protection, education, and the law.